The third thing is clearly, again, on the environment. I think we have to realize that we have unleashed the aspirations of a billion people. We can't say, okay, you guys can go back and live those simple lives because nature says so, because all of them have their aspirations have been unleashed. And I think the big difference between the Western environmental thing and India was that their development happened when populations were much smaller. They could export their pollution by either having colonies or by outsourcing. And fundamentally, I think tropical forests are probably much more complex than temperate forests. So in that sense, we have a bigger thing to save. So then question is, how do we find this combination? Because it's not environment versus development. How do we get a development model which allows us to meet the aspirations of people for a better life and make sure that we don't create environmental degradation? And that, I think, nobody really has the answer for that. It's not creating Nagarhole and then driving an SUV to Nagarhole and saying, wow, this forest is so pristine, and then coming back. I think it's about how do we change everything around us to create a model of environment and development, and that's the third big thing that we need to worry about. So I've talked about how do we tunnel through the future by converting democracy into a source of advantage. How do we create a post-carbon economy, which is very different from anything we have seen? How do we create an environment and development paradigm which allows us to meet the aspirations of a billion people, at the same time doesn't cause environmental havoc that we see? And then we have to think about the issue of social insurance. One of the challenges today, which is happening in Western society, in aging societies, is the huge cost of social entitlements. If you look at the programs that they have, like Social Security, like Medicare, Mediclaim, just in the United States, the unfunded liability of these 3 or 4 programs is about $50 trillion, which is about 3 times the GDP. And all this happened because when these schemes were designed in the 30s, at the time of the New Deal and Roosevelt and all that, the full understanding of the demographic cycle and how aging happens and how the cost goes up was not fully understood. Now we understand all that stuff, and therefore we have to come out with a program of social insurance, whether it's pensions, whether it's unemployment insurance, whether it's health insurance, all this in a way which provides those basic services to the people, at the same time doesn't create an unsustainable liability for the state 30, 40 years from now. And again, there's enough thinking now. We have seen what happened to them. We have a way of rethinking our way of social insurance. Part of that, again, is to go towards direct benefits. In other words, today, for example, we have subsidies. But the subsidies are essentially regressive because the rich and the poor get the same subsidies. If petrol price is lower, you who all drove in your car to this conference, as well as the person who has no car, essentially the subsidies are perverse. They go to the rich and the middle class. And therefore, we have to go towards a different model of subsidies where we address the challenges of the poor, but give it to them directly in their hands and not through this broad brush subsidy route. And that, I think, is a whole part of what we have to do in the social insurance area, which is define a way that we are able to give these direct benefits. Because often the subsidies that we give today, for example, in India, all of them are in some sense against the environment. When we give cheap fuel, cheap hydrocarbon fuel, we're embedding the subsidy in the fuel price, and therefore you're actually encouraging the use of hydrocarbons. When you give cheap power, you're encouraging more drilling of groundwater. When you give cheap phosphatic fertilizer, you're increasing the likelihood that the soil will become unsustainable. So in other words, the whole subsidy paradigm is very perverse and actually encourages bad behavior. And therefore, we have to rethink our whole model of pensions, social insurance, health insurance, and direct benefits to the poor in a radically different way, so that we strive this balance between their development and making sure that the environment and the economy survive. Of the so-called economic development and industrialization of the last 200 years, the average GDP growth was about 2 to 2.5% a year. So it was a very slow thing. And when the populations were maybe about 100 million or 50 million or 200 million. And it was a time when democratic rights were not fully given in many of these countries. So you had a situation where you had low growth, you had less democracy, and you had small populations. In India's case, there's a radical shift. Because just in 40 years back, India's economic growth was growing at about 3.5%, and its population was growing at about 2%. And in that era, growth was also slow, and income of people was doubling once in 45 years. Today, if your economy is growing at 8 or 9%, and your population growth rate has come down to 1.5%, your incomes are doubling every 9 years. In other words, your whole thing has gone into fast forward. It's gone into a 5 times increase in speed. It's like something that was going at 10 miles per hour, suddenly going at 50 miles per hour. And this change is something which we have not fully comprehended. And a lot of the challenges that we face and we talk about are because the pace of change, the change of other things, the change in our mindsets, the change in our governance, the change in our institutions, the change in our society, those changes are not keeping pace with this very rapid change. And therefore we really have to, the same thing is happening on health. It's, that's why we're going from this one end of the health spectrum to another end in 10 years. And therefore, to rethink the way we look at our health, our public health, the way we design our cities, the way we design our transportation, the way we design our food chains, all that to make sure that we promote public health. Because today, for example, the United States spends 15% of GDP on healthcare. And that's the only area where things are growing at double digits. All this will require fundamentally new thinking. These solutions don't exist in universities in the United States. A collective body of people thinking about these issues and influencing them in different ways. These are not, you can't take, one guy can't take a decision and do this stuff. It's not, some dictator is not going to solve this problem for us. Really, don't expect that. I think, I frankly don't know whether you can convince a billion people whose aspirations have been unleashed to say, just cut back. I don't think that's going to happen. And I don't think it's going to happen politically, because I don't think any politician is going to win an election by saying that. And therefore we have to accept that reality, that on the one hand, we have unleashed aspirations of a lot of people, and genuinely for many of them, they do deserve a better life. And second, we will not be able to create the politics of that. So to me, the thing is, certainly how do we channelize the demand side to have demand for more, what you can call as good things, as opposed to bad things. And certainly we need to create a model of thinking as to what those good things are. But it's not going to come from suppression of demand or by expecting people to live like saints. It's not going to happen.
Well, I'm actually talking about suppression of supply rather than the suppression of demand. Demand is